Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Emergency Services Times. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times. With our partner Airbox today, we'll be talking about protests and how the emergency services can communicate and share situational awareness. This is a webinar with a chat and no presentation, no slides, but a valuable conversation that leaves you inspired to find out more. We have a Q&A function. You'll see it on the side of your screen there. So please add questions as we go along and we'll get to them as we can. Please try to keep them short, and questions rather than statements would be really helpful. You'll also receive CPD accreditation for joining us today. We'll send that to you once the webinar is finished. And if you're watching on catch up, you'll get that at the end of the month. Our plan today is to run for 50 minutes in total. So let's get started. I'll be joined by my panel on the screen. Lovely. I'm delighted to introduce Steve Killick, Andy Hunt and Pat Knowles. Steve is Tactical Director for Airbox. Andy is a public order, public safety subject matter expert at the College of Policing. And Pat Knowles is multi-agency and NILO support officer with Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. Welcome to you all.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, as usual with our webinars, we start with a strategic context. So we're going to be looking at why we are interested in protests. We've seen a lot of protest across the country, and in particular last summer, and that is the inspiration for today's webinar. I just wanted to look at the HMI CFRS, so they're the Inspectorate for Police and Fire, and something they said in their report on the response to the 2024 riots. They said that all agencies must share information effectively so that they can keep people safe. They also had a recommendation in that report where they said that the National Police Chiefs Council, the College of Policing, Chief Constables and the Home Office should create a plan. Create a plan and begin work to improve the police service's capacity and capability to respond to widespread disorder. And whilst that quote is specifically about police, we want to widen this conversation out to include fire and rescue. So I'm going to ask my panel to start with to talk about how the services respond to disorder and what the role of those services are. So can I first ask Andy to give us a sense of what it's like to be a public order, public safety officer and what you would be anticipating when something like this happens? How does that work for you as a police officer?
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, I'll just give you a bit of context about who I am and what my role is. I'm a current serving police officer at Norfolk Constabulary. I am a public order officer, which means I'm trained to deal with large-scale disorder, public order type operations. I'm trained in the kit and equipment that we would wear to deal with those types of situations. I'm a public order, public safety advisor as well, which means I would give advice to commanders who would command a large-scale public order event. And I'm also an instructor to train public order to officers in force as well. So without delving into the weeds too much around the disorder that took place last year and the reasons for that, I think 2024 we saw some of the largest disorder this country's seen for quite some time, and the scale of that spread nationally and spread quickly, and that is down to the spread of information. Now, whether that information was false or inaccurate, which was later proven to be, that was something which we effectively played catch up on, which is trying to quell that spread of information, which led to disorder spreading across the country. And it effectively began in one particular place, one particular part of the country, and then spread very quickly from there. That's not something which we've had to deal with before in the police, particularly with large-scale disorder, particularly at the scale of which and the rate of which it spread. And that ultimately is down to the platforms that are now available to the public and the number, the scale of places in which that can spread. Obviously, we've been used to the mainstream media in the past, and now there are a myriad of different outlets and forms of platforms where that information can be gathered from. So that sort of sets a scene in a looser sense around what we were up against in 2024. And obviously that's now led to a number of inquiries which have a number of recommendations which have led us here, and ultimately to my role within the college, which is ensuring that we can facilitate those recommendations and that they're put in place for future. So if we have to deal with this scale or this type of disorder again, we're better equipped to do so.
Okay, so you've set that out nicely in terms of the unusual nature of what happened in 2024. Now, Pat, in terms of you in your role as a NILO, perhaps you can explain what a NILO is to our audience and how in Greater Manchester you would prepare for something like this.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everybody. So the NILO role, NILO stands for National Interagency Liaison Officer. Part of their key duties during the day is to have the communication links, particularly between GMP and MWAS, and they are the main point of communication into, Force Operations Centre with the Force Incident Managers and the national, and then the MWAS leads, our North West Ambulance Service colleagues as well. So as far as protesting goes, my role at the moment as multi-agency NILO support officer is working in contingency planning unit, which we plan for significant events that will be taking place across Manchester, and also events that could have potential wider impacts on, things like public safety or other elements. So everything from planning the Christmas markets, which begin this weekend, to responding to and preparing for disorder that has become from a particular incident. We know that 2024 tensions were very, very much heightened in the country and continue to be so. We just finished or completed Op Protector, which was the Conservative Party conference. And obviously we look at any high profile events where we get high profile delegates and candidates coming into the city centre can inevitably result in things like planned protests. Planned protests are something that we are aware of and that we're comfortable with, obviously that are then communicated through GMP. But as Andy very aptly said just a minute ago, with the spread of information on social media can then pose specific or quite significant issues to us, particularly when we look at what response would be to incidents surrounding sort of said protests. So our NILO would be the key communication link between GMP. They would provide all the information on meetings for when we produce things that are called op orders, which are preparation for said events. And then we would look at our strategic sort of ability to respond and also what our response would look like should we have a large scale incident related to the disorder or in and around the disorder to keep the people that we're working with safe. We also, as we've learned over the past sort of 18 months, have a duty of care to all of our staff. So not just operational responders, for anybody that would potentially be working within the areas where this disorder will be taking place, to make sure that everybody has the right information and the clear, concise information that they need to be able to safely obviously carry out their duties as well. So all the NILO link in between all of this is a real key role for us.
Great, thank you for that. I'm just wondering, Steve, so with the conversation so far with Andy and Pat has been very much about information from social media, from wider networks, not necessarily between emergency services. This webinar was going to be about sharing information effectively to keep people safe with a very sort of internal intro-view. In terms of you as the supplier of Airbox solutions, do you see the sharing of information being information coming into the services or simply the information within the services when they're responding to something like public disorder?
So I think it's both, and Airbox software is designed primarily to do the internal stuff, but it is capable of receiving external feeds and then sharing external feeds as well. So our view is the more information that an individual or an officer or a responder can understand in a single place or a single pane of glass, is a term that Airbox have used previously, then probably the better informed the decision will be made and the better understanding of the situation. So I suppose from our perspective is we would sort of certainly suggest that as much information that is appropriate that gets to the individual officer and the decision makers, and again that information is concurrent and exact across the breadth of that operation. So the strategic leads, tactical lead, and the operational lead will all see the same sort of what we would call common operating picture or situational awareness. So I think it's critical internally, but then the external feeds, including open source, definitely assist and will increase that awareness and understanding.
Okay. And the question that we have here from Adam is, he says, what's different between 2024 and 2011? Social media, he's right, was well established in 2011. So, and he says nationwide public disorder spread rapidly then. Andy, I think you responded in 2011 to, you mentioned to
Yes.
You could respond on that question for us.
I think the two, he's absolutely right. The two are not too dissimilar in their nature. I think with 2024 was more of a national scale, and the rate at which it spread across the country was down to the sheer access of information, and is not quite where it was in 2011. We still had social media, we sure did, but I think the scale and rate at which it spread was much faster in 2024, just because of the number of platforms that we now are aware that were available to attendees. And actually, we were slightly behind the curve on that rate of information and where that was coming from. So I think the difference between the two, the reasons for the two were different, and I think the spread led to that sort of national sort of fallout, whereas 2011 was mainly centred to a couple of areas in the country. It wasn't quite at the scale that we saw in 2024.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So Steve, in terms of the planning process, so we've talked a bit about contingency planning and about how you kind of make sure that you have your resources, you know what your risks are, you know how you're going to deal with disorder when it happens. In terms of what you're able to see as the supplier in this, what are you able to offer the services that make them better prepared? What does Airbox look like? What is it in a nutshell for our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I mean, kind of linked to my previous point, again, the idea is to cover the breadth of the command, and in the policing, the emergency service perspective, we're talking gold all the way through down to bronze. And equally, I probably should have mentioned earlier, so I've been with Airbox now as the tactical director for a year, and that really means that I do the principal engagement with the emergency services and the military. And I joined them last year in October after 38 years in the military. So I come as an Airbox user. I've been using Airbox software since 2017, and much of that, both exercising operationally, has been in support of policing. So, you know, I still deem myself, although I work for Airbox, I still deem myself as a sort of a previous operational user. And so my experience, again, aside from both the breadth of command from gold all the way down to bronze, the software can provide support to organizations all the way through what I call the full cycle of an exercise, an event, or an operation. So the planning all the way through to the post-operational stuff. But I suppose in response to your specific question on the planning side, so Airbox software is designed to work both on and offline, and it's principally, in a simplest form, a digital map book. So it allows you to have maps, charts, aerial photography, schematics, and overlays, both in an offline and online capability. Clearly, there's greater power and greater ability to share when you're online, but offline you can do a lot of stuff in isolation to then be shared when you have that connectivity or choose to have that connectivity. So as well as having those sort of overlays that you can use for planning and assessment, you can create your own overlays. There's a whole raft of annotation available, iconography, which includes gesture icons, the ability to create shapes, geofence cordons on whatever overlay you choose, or whatever mapping you choose to use, which will then inform. So you can mark an out of bounds area, a route to, a route from, a rendezvous point, a helicopter landing site. All of that can be done prior to the operation, prior to the event, so that can all be shared by all the users. And equally, both live or prior to the operation, you can hang documents, imagery, and video within the system itself. So all those will be available to everybody in that operation, whether they're pre-positioned there for the operation, i.e. a contingency plan or a video that gives a walkthrough of a venue but doesn't need to be used until the event goes live. All those can be stored and housed within that operation that will be shared by all those users, whether those be the officers at bronze all the way through up to goals.
Okay, so there's a lot in that. We're going to move on to talk about geospatial information shortly, but just in terms of that planning and preparation stage, if you know that something's going to happen or you can anticipate it, then it's easier to plan for it. But when things are spontaneous and the flare-up is fast and unexpected, what difference does that make in terms of your response and your need to share information, Pat? When you come across things which are very kind of quick flare-ups, how do you kind of take all that contingency planning and put it into action to respond very quickly?
So we built up very, very good relationships with our local police networks. OGMP are the major sort of key player in spontaneous flare-ups, obviously with it being their responsibility. The relationship we built, we would commit people into Silver, so their tactical command or tactical coordinating cell. within GMP headquarters. And then again, through the information sharing, through the updates, we could use tools such as Airbox to pre-plan over an incident, to look at what mobilisation would look like, to ensure that we knew exactly who had been mobilised to the incident and where they were. And then as part of that, the wider picture would be, we have significant number of resources committed to support the resolution of an incident and for the public safety, what that would look like if we had, or how does that affect our response sort of elsewhere. So the key sort of point for our input for this today is that interoperability and that ability to share the information quickly and having the right platforms to be able to put that on so that everybody else can see it as well.
Okay, so communication keeps coming up. Andy, in terms of communication featuring in the planning phase and thinking about what you spoke about at the Emergency Services Show when you and your colleague Laura spoke about responding to public disorder, and you were very much about equipment and what you were wearing, but it was very much about bringing those units together, communicating. And could you just explain a little bit about when you are in your unit responding, how you are communicating back to your control room, to your incident command, just trying to understand it from a kind of on the ground perspective?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, as you've alluded to there, if you are aware an incident's going to happen and we can be afforded time to plan, that's far easier for us, and any plan, if you get more time you get to do it, the more thorough it's going to be. But obviously with spontaneous bits and bobs, spontaneous incidents that pop up, we need to have contingency plans in place, which we do have. And we work through a very simple set of principles, so to speak, before we would look to resource an incident. One of those is communication. So what do those communication protocols look like? Obviously, the majority of our communication is done via radio, but within a large-scale public order operation, you might water down the number of units, I suppose, that can have input and communication through those channels, just because of the sheer number of officers that you might deploy to a large scale operation. So they might be, you might have those communication channels direct with supervisory command, all the way down to boots on the ground to your gold, silver and bronze cells who will be located elsewhere whilst that incident is going on. Obviously, having been on the ground in large-scale public disorder myself, that can have its challenges, but can also have its benefits as well. There's a lot of onus placed upon you supervision to make sure that welfare and officer safety is paramount before we go and deal with anything else. And also the flow of information and intelligence is steady enough so that we can command and steer the event and effectively deal with what we're faced with in front of us and the challenges that present itself. Obviously, I think Pat will probably talk about JESIP a bit later on, and that's something which we work together on as well. And that JESIP is, in its essence, is emergency services working together and sharing that information, ensuring that communication flows between the services. Hands up, it's not something we in the police have been very good at over the last few years, but definitely is getting much better now. And I think that has improved as years have gone on. Would you say, Pat, as well?
I'd absolutely agree, and I think particularly with the co-location and coordination, the better the sort of tools that we have, where we're all using the same software, means that we can understand sort of each other's sort of priorities really, and agree those who's going to lead what priorities are people working to. But more importantly, the joint understanding of risk, because the risk could be completely different, and I might require, or the tactical commander at an incident might require a particular level of protection that we would then rely on Andy to say, we can afford you this once we've carried out a particular task. And it's just inevitably to keep the responders in a safe, maximise the safety of the responders on the ground as part of the tactical sort of approach to the incident, really gives us that good ground truth and being able to sort of put a plan into place very quickly, rather than us all sort of working separately in our own little cohorts to bring that sort of information together.
So it's good to hear you talking about JESIP spontaneously there. I didn't even ask you a question about it, so that's excellent. So in terms of, you talk about communications protocols, you talk about JESIP. Steve, you mentioned JESIP when you were talking about the Airbox system. So in terms of all those protocols and the communications, does that get edited specifically to a particular service when they buy that, or is that something that's just integral to the system?
So much of the JESIP stuff is already integral into the system, and it depends whether the users want to use it. We're also working closely with the emergency service, and particularly Jessup, through the Chiefs Council about better understanding what the requirements are collectively, so we can incorporate that into the software. But as it stands, yeah, iconography within there complies by, or certain iconography complies by Jessup standards. We're also trying to build that. There's a whole raft of Jessup checklists within the system as well. So methane and e-methane and a couple of other checklists that can be worked through that then feature as auditable and recorded decisions through the system that then can be interrogated and used at later date.
And so you mean when the incident is over in terms of debriefing and then perhaps going into a learning process? Is that what you mean by that?
Absolutely. And potentially should there be an inquiry as well?
Yes. Okay. So it's capturing that for future records as well. Excellent.
Right,
okay.
Yes.
So you talked about geospatial data earlier, talking about mapping and layers and so forth. I suppose I'm interested in asking the question about allocating resources and where should they go. So Andy's there with his POPSA units, and he's advising event incidents maybe from afar when he's not on the ground. How do we allocate resources and know where to put them when you have a system like yours? And how does that integrate with existing systems, which would be all about where you put things? So I wonder, Andy, can you just describe to us how that works in terms of how do you decide where to put people? And are you all using maps, or how does this work?
Yeah, again, it goes down to spontaneous and planned events. Obviously, with planned events, we'd have a myriad of maps available to us, which would be in both digital form and obviously physical. We're information and intelligence led, so ultimately it will be, where is that information coming? Where is that intelligence? Where can we identify our threat and risk? Where is that? Where are we at high risk? Where are we medium? Where are we low? Where do we need to tackle those potential hotspots which are going to cause us some issues? Example, if you take football for an example, we'd want to avoid clashes between conflicting supporters. So what we'd probably do is look to position our units at specific locations to avoid that from happening, to reduce the risk of flashpoints from taking place. So certainly for something like a football match, you most definitely would have maps available to you, because you'd have essentially 3 phases to an event. You'd have pre-event, during the event, and after the event, and each of those phases can be very different to each other because they can present different risks in different areas. So that's where ultimately positioning of resources and units would most definitely come into play, and that's just one example of where we'd use maps and positioning for that to happen.
Okay, so that suggests lots of information that you already hold. When you don't hold the information, you need to dynamically access it, or bring in other partners to help you because the incident is changing, it's dynamic. Steve, is that something that, in terms of Airbox, how does it deal with adding in new information and new systems on the fly, or is it all pre-programmed, has to just be there to start with?
No, so assuming that other users or other responders are on Airbox software, then assuming the correct data sharing permissions are in, then Andy and Pat could share their operational information by being invited into one or other operation. So for argument's sake, the first responding force would own the operation, and any other Airbox users responding to that with the correct permissions pre-planned, then they could be invited into operation. So you can work very much in isolation. Andy could work in isolation with his team, but when he wanted to, with those data permissions in place, he could then share with Pat and wider, subject to his permissions and his ability to invite people into the operation. So that's the ability to build on that. Anyone external to Airbox, you can send messages to them, and so they can stream, they can give their positional data and stream in video, so they could see that, and that could be witnessed by the officers within that particular Airbox operation for users without Airbox software. And that's a function called iSend, and I think it's similar to the sort of standalone Good SAM capability that exists as well. But again, for the dynamic response, although we talked about pre-planning, hanging things in there early, annotation can be added as they're required. Live streaming of video, sharing of photographs, they can be done in real time, so they don't have to be placed in the system and then be accessed on a more deliberate way. If I then share something spontaneously, everywhere that operation will also be able to see it and access it as it comes in. Likewise, if I add a geofence, if I add an out of bounds area, if I add particular icons or an area for someone to move to search to, those will be immediately is subject to everyone having connectivity. They'll immediately update it across the operation, so everybody will see the same data and be sharing the same data within that operation.
Okay, so this is the point which I bring Pat in to say, Pat, you have decided to use Airbox, try it out with some of the NILOs. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about why you've decided to do that, and to pick up specifically this point about geofencing. I'm quite interested in that, this idea of creating an area and how that works to respond to operational need that you have.
Yeah, so if I briefly touch on the question that we've posed to Andy and Steve there, I think the designation of RVP points in the city centre is a key one for us. And then obviously from RVP points, we can then establish forward control points too, when it's obviously been designated or the risk assessment's been done to move responders forward. And one of the benefits that Airbox has given us over the past 6 weeks or so that we've been using it is being able to digitally map areas in quite sort of quick succession. We trialled it at a very large military exercise just a couple of weeks ago, where we've had to gather our own sort of immediate situational awareness and plot that onto a map, to then be invited into a mission that is then shared by the military. And it just gives us that real visual representation from the exact point that we are, points of no entry, points of access, sort of best access routes or egress sensors. We can also put things like casualty clearing points. We could also highlight decontamination areas. So real key sort of areas that we're going to avoid sending any sort of personnel that are unprepared through an area of heightened risk, and to ensure that obviously operations can be got to work in a much sort of quicker dynamic. Airbox has been really, really good and seamless for joining onto other people's missions, for the interagency communication between that. There is the facility to also to protect sensitive information that may be passed through. So, for example, if Andy was running an operation and there was elements of the information that weren't really relevant to fire, or there were particularly sensitive information about, persons of interest or casualties, for example, from an ambulance point of view, they can protect that information, but on the other side of it, give us the wider information that we're required to respond safely and to timestamp that, as well as Steve then said, for inquiry purposes afterwards. So in a nutshell, the visual representation, the agreed designated RVPs, the agreed FCPs, and more importantly, the safest route for appliances or a large number of appliances or other responding vehicles to make into obviously the affected area is second to none.
Okay, well, before I ask you to talk about geofencing a bit more, just to respond on that point about tagging information. So is it the case with police officers working on operations, would you have an allocation of what you can see based on your role? Is that standard operating procedure for you?
Not essentially, because that would be probably more handled by a unit, an intelligence unit, and then they would pass that information through to a commander who's running an event. In terms of real-time information, that would come via airwaves or radio messaging and be fed up through the command chain in that way. So it would be tagged, but only if it's recorded within a computer system, which we would probably do at a later date. But whilst that information is flying in, obviously, as you can imagine, at quite a fast rate, with a large-scale incident, we respond to that in real time. And if needs be, that information will be recorded elsewhere.
Right. Okay. So the officers on the ground are there. Do they have radios and are they listening to what's going on?
Yeah.
So they're just getting the information that's relevant for them at that point where they are.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So on the geofencing side of things, I have this idea in my head of a map with a big line around it, and we just allocate into this space. Is that something that you're experimenting with, Pat, or is that something that you were doing before, but it's just now different?
So we would always put things like cordons or hazard zones over particular areas, because obviously the information that was coming in would also be fed back to our control rooms. The control rooms use slightly different software where they would put sort of hazard overlays on, or they may increase the predetermined attendance to particular incidents in with heightened tension, or areas of the potential for higher risk of firefighters if there were only a certain number of appliances that would usually attend. But the geofencing capability particularly is just a good idea. It gives us the best sort of visual planning perspective of where the affected areas are, but particularly for adding things like cordons or designated no-go zones for things like CBRN incidents. Again, if we talk about a rapidly sort of escalating situation with what began as a protest with things like fire or vehicles or weapon or potential CBRN attacks, it's rather than sort of having an idea of sort of what we're talking about as responders, we're doing over the bonnet gesture meetings, for example, at a tactical level. Again, it's just the discussions, the agreement, but then using things like our command unit to stream sort of live images to say, right, this is where the agreed areas are. This is the geofence that's been put over the top at the moment. This is obviously the wider affected area if we need to put things in like 600-metre cordons, or particularly for evacuation of large buildings or areas that are very densely populated with members of the public. So it's, again, that the difference that Airbox has made to us is the visual, as well as just the, looking at the predetermined maps and anything else that's been put in place at the time.
Okay, so that visual representation, Steve, seems to have making a big difference. In terms of those who are not involved with the incident, the business as usual around the edges of this map that we've mapped out. How did those people as business as usual know what's happening, and how do you does it make a difference to those managing their resources on the business as usual side, even though the incident's taking place in a particular geographical space? How does Airbox kind of manage those two things that are happening at the same time?
Well, I suppose it depends on how the deployment of the software is enabled. And again, we've got a large portion of we've got some of the emergency services that have adopted Airbox software, from sort of air ambulance to some of the NHS trust to a lot of policing, and then the fire and rescue teams are looking at as well. From a policing perspective, it's fairly heavy within the armed policing and surveillance policing. So those tend to be the principal users of the software. So those outside those organisations might not be using the software as business as usual, and therefore there wouldn't be a way that we could interact with them other than the normal form of communications. But if there was an organisation that sat outside these responders, but was conducting business as usual using Airbox software, because although, in my opinion, the software comes into its own when it's a spontaneous event, that can't be the only use of the software. The software has a whole raft of capabilities that can support business as usual. And in my opinion, it can support, as I said earlier, the full cycle of an operational exercise. So it's just incorporating how that would work collectively together. So yeah, it can be separated off. Business as usual can continue to use their Airbox software in that vein while the spontaneous event is still continuing, or the deliberate event that doesn't require the others in there. But they are able to come in if required. The key part, I suppose, depending on the deployment, is it tends to find that where there is a operational room or control room, they would have visibility of both the spontaneous and the business as usual, and they would be able to see the overlays collectively of all that activity. So rather than having 4 or 5 different feeds, they could see collectively everything that's going on, but equally be able to separate out the business detail and then use some of those assets and elements if required to support the spontaneous, but whilst also keeping an eye on the spontaneous, how that is building.
And do you see that operating in the control room? Is that what the control room officers are seeing, these different layers and different sort of the incident and the business as usual?
We can set up a whole raft of missions as organisations can work in very small groups and departments, or they can expand that out. We can also provide some of the more authorised users to get greater visibility of their own users. So rather than just having surveillance team 1, they would have overview of surveillance team 1 to 6, because that's what they're working. So we would set the permissions up with the agreement of the particular users of how they want and who they would want to have visible at what stage. So we can put a whole level of sort of protection around it, so that a surveillance operator in team 1 doesn't see everything that's going on in the other 6 teams, but actually the control room, the lead surveillance command, the force incident manager, whoever was commanding that operation, would have overview of all the assets, so they could then deal as appropriately, whether they were responding to a spontaneous event or whether they were just doing business as usual, or a combination of both.
Right, because that makes me think about the mental load of all this information, because we've got all these layers of mapping data. You mentioned also video, you've mentioned audio, there's information sharing. It's an awful lot to take in, so being able to allocate those roles, make it very distinct as to what people get to. I mean, Andy, in terms of the mental load of officers having to deal with disorder when they're up taking command and dealing with all this, how do you look after officers to make sure that they're not overloaded and it's not too much for them? How does that work?
I think that's a really valuable point, Catherine. And it's one of the recommendations that have come out of the Tranche 1 HMI IC report into the disorder last year is welfare of officers, and can be down to a number of things. Can be down to environment, can be down to the kit we wear, and the expectation upon officers to deal with that disorder. So that needs to be resourced effectively. It needs to be resourced so that we can ensure we can replace officers who are dealing with those incidents on the front lines effectively, and make sure that we've got plans in place so we're not asking too much of our officers, so that we can get the best out of them when they're performing these tactics on the ground. And a lot of the tactics we perform on the ground are quite attritional. They're hands-on. There's a fitness level requirement for officers to be able to do this role. The kit is very heavy. The shields we carry are heavy. The tactics we use, involve a lot of moving parts. So it's really important that we look after those officers on the ground. Now that can come with a number of logistical barriers, where we would have a brain of the command, so to speak, dedicated to logistics and dedicated to welfare provision. That can be something as simple as popping to Domino's and getting a load of pizzas in for the troops, or making sure that we've got adequate welfare provision, particularly around water, and especially around refreshment breaks, and ensuring that we're rotating those officers regularly and then not being exposed for prolonged periods in those disorder type situations.
Yes, I held one of those, the riot shields at the show, and it was very heavy, I can confirm.
Yeah.
Okay, so Pat, let's talk a little bit more about your trial that you're doing with Airbox in terms of video and audio. Are you using any of those aspects in terms of your trial so far, in terms of the capabilities that Airbox has?
Yeah, so we're currently trialling 4 licenses, and we're going to expand that out slightly with officers with some different qualifications. But we're trying to test the software over a kind of variety of sort of operational incidents, operational responses, and training sessions. One of the key benefits we found with the video is for users, as Steve said before, those who aren't using the Airbox software, but we can use the iSend capability across to a mobile number where they are able to stream from the actual scene itself. So if we imagine that we put this into a rapidly escalating public disorder incident, and we have a tactical officer who has the mobile phone capability, that we then get them to stream live back to us, that video is also then sort of stored within the mission itself. So again, we can see from even a tactical or a strategic position who may be far away from the incident, just to get a real idea of what's actually happening. That can help us to additionally resource. That can also help us to downscale if we would need to as well. So again, thinking of that business continuity piece as this incident is happening. And more importantly, from a major incident point of view, if this was to go into major incident territory, and that was a methane was to be declared, or methane was to be shared amongst all the services, it gives us that better understanding that we can also share with other people as well. So the video and the audio usage has been particularly successful as part of the trial so far.
Okay, so Steve, just to understand in terms of video and audio, so if, as Pat describes it, it's being used spontaneously, it's being gathered at the incident, at pace probably, how does it then get stored in your system, both in terms of being able to be added to the situational awareness that you've gathered through all this mapping and planning from before, but also in terms of storing it ready to be used for debriefing, learning, and potentially inquiries if it gets that far?
Yeah, no. So just to be clear, the video comes without audio that streams either internally or externally. So it is a video feed only. There's no audio capability yet. But with regards to storage, so everything that happens within the operation will feature in what we call a timeline. So it's almost like an ops log. It is quite detailed. It will cover everything from Pat creating a geofence to me entering or removing the geofence, or when I hang a document, when I hang an image. But there is an ability to promote things. So the key parts, so if there's commander's decisions within that timeline or created, then they can be promoted. So they will feature significantly in a promotive area rather than having a whole raft of both admin tasks and operational tasks in there. But everything is recorded sequentially in that timeline. Everything is then saved locally within the devices and within our servers. So the users, unless they archive the operation, will have access to that themselves for a period of time. When it then becomes archived, Airbox will store that data until either the contract ceases or the user requests for that data to be deleted. So all that data is recoverable should it be requested 10 years down the line, on the assumption that the user hasn't requested that data to be deleted. So it is always returnable, both in its raw data, or Airbox can deliver it as a sort of a file or a project, so it will then lay out exactly who was where at what stage, what happened in the timeline, geographic overlays of how the officers moved around the environments, what was exchanged, images who were deleted, who changed the document name. All of that is recoverable and within an auditable format.
Okay, no, that sounds ideal when you're thinking about, hopefully not getting to an inquiry, but in terms of being able to provide all of that. Now we have a question here, which is from Gary. He asks about whether we can expand on how Airbox is being used reactively to moving situations. We've done a little bit about this already, but how easy is it for users on the ground to add road closures, etc., so that other users can see? So we've talked about adding video in there, but in terms of it's like a bit like Waze, isn't it? When you're driving along and you kind of go, oh, there's a crash, something's happened here, I'll put that in. You're kind of adding to the collective knowledge of the road. Does it work in the same way with Airbox, Steve?
Yeah, it does. So Waze is available as an overlay. So you can have Waze toggled on. And I think I haven't used it that frequently myself, but I think it has hotspots, accidents, and road closures. So all those are toggleable off and on, depending on what overlay or mapping you're using. And again, if you use the online capability, that's the Google Maps suite. Google Traffic is now incorporating that, so you can toggle Google Traffic on and off. So you've got those as reference points based on wider data pools coming in. But equally, if as an officer you identify that a road was closed, whatever your collective icon or whether you're just going to cross through it, you can just mark that out with annotation, just putting a line along that road, red line, or whatever is deemed appropriate, and that would be shared within the team. So you've both got the external feeds, Waze and Google Traffic, and whatever internal sort of processes you want to put in place with regards to marking and distributing that detail internally within the software.
Okay. So Andy, in terms of day-to-day policing then, when you see something like that and you want to add to bring that very hyper-local knowledge back into a national system, whether that's for a major incident or maybe just a day-to-day working, how do you share that kind of information back to base?
I suppose just at the moment through traditional methods, using radios, using communication channels like we normally would do. Obviously, we have body-worn video. That I'm aware of. Well, certainly I'm only aware of the body-worn video system we use, which can't be tapped into remotely. But obviously, we can provide that as a visual aid if we need to. And obviously, all officers nowadays have access to things like Microsoft Teams and software such as that. So we can always pass that information on. But as time goes on, technology advances, and we're becoming more and more adept at utilising that for day-to-day policing, so to speak. But obviously, there's processes that have to go through. There's approvals that have to take place in order for us to be able to utilise that equipment. But we're certainly way ahead than we were, say, 10 years ago. We're much more adept at sharing that information, and certainly our contact and control rooms most definitely are as well.
Yes, and you mentioned body-worn video, which I should have thought of when we were talking about video feeds. So in terms of the streaming of that, if that was being used on officer, and I'm poking at myself because that's where I imagine my body-worn video is. If that's on and streaming, then could it potentially stream directly into Airbox and become a feed into the system? I mean, you just talked about being quite protected. That's quite a tunnel, but is that possible, Steve?
Yeah, potentially, yes. So our product and tech team are working very hard on an open API that would ingest a whole collection of data, whether it be geographical data, positional data, whether it be video streams from other third-party providers. We've done it on a case-by-case basis previously. We're trying to deliver that more centrally. So with engagement with whatever third-party provider and Airbox, if it was in a suitable format that Airbox could ingest, then potentially it could be visible as another screen as you would share videos within Mosaic. So it's all within the mobile application or the applications. It's work in progress. It doesn't exist yet, but it's certainly on the strategic roadmap for the product and tech team.
Oh, interesting. So Pat, are you using body-worn video in Greater Manchester in the fire service? Do you have it?
So we're currently using body-worn video with our assistant principal officers. They're our area managers. There is a big procurement piece for all flexi duty and operational commanders. So watch manager, crew managers on appliances will inevitably be using body-worn in the next few months, but that piece is just about to be completed.
And would you think that would work well to have body-worn video being streamed into a central system like Airbox in terms of managing incidents? Do you see the benefit?
I think it would be very positive. I think one thing for fire and rescue services is the drone usage, particularly the police as well. So the drone footage being available on the platform would be really, really useful, because again, it's just building up that bigger picture, particularly for reconvening sort of Jessup meetings. So you have your agreement, your agreed actions, and what you would take away. But then when you come about in the next 20 minutes or hour to sort of reconvene and see where we're up to with the common operating picture, that footage again would be vital really for sort of what we need to do, whether it's upscale or downscale an incident.
Yeah, and Andy, thinking about National Police Air Service, the MPAS, the uplink, the what they see up in the skies, that streaming into a central system, being able to see that along with everything else, does that exist in policing already? Do you know? I mean, I know you're not an MPAS person.
Yes, yeah, I'm not an MPAS person, no, but I do know that facility does exist. Drone, it definitely as well is an area that's moved on vastly within the area of policing over the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, and has now almost become an indispensable piece of equipment at most public order operations that we certainly deal with.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Just this relatively short conversation, Steve, about how many streams of information are coming into a command or whoever's looking after the incident, all the different types of information, the different sources, and yet that making sense of all of that is that's an awful lot of information to take on. Just to finish off on the video point, there's a question here about is Airbox able to access and store live streamed videos from platforms such as YouTube, using to gather valuable intelligence? Is that something that you're thinking about or can do?
I do know in the fact that there are a couple of our product leads listen to this, so hopefully they're scribbling furiously down with all the bits and pieces. But we're looking at providing as much capability as possible. What we would prefer to do is be able to over inundate you with data, and the officers or the responders select which data they wanted to see, because just because you're getting all that data in doesn't mean you have to view it and be, cognitively overloaded with all that data. You can then elect to see which data is important to you, because there might be 60% of it that is not appropriate for your role at that time. So the view, the more we can get into the system and the more ability for the responder to select what they want to view would definitely help. And I think that does include open source, and it'll be something that we work on in time, but the priority will still sit probably with the current systems that the emergency services are using, and which to integrate is already part of their portfolio.
Yes. And so all of that, of course, very important in terms of debriefing. So we talked about inquiries, so that's what's one extreme. But in terms of that day-to-day need to debrief from the incident, gather the learning, put that into changes in perhaps training and procedures. And so, Andy, in terms of authorised professional practice in policing, is that the cycle that you're looking for, is to kind of see that debriefing information coming back into the system so that you can improve what you're doing for policing at the college?
Yeah, effectively, of course. And policing has always been an area where we have an incident nationally, there's an inquiry or learning takes place, and then we put that into our authorised professional practice. So we learn from experiences, we learn from incidences, often from things we don't do so well, often from things that we do well. We're still learning from the disorder that's currently taking place, it's still taking place this year, which again is a different shade from last year's process. Public order is always evolving, it's always changing. It might be dormant for a couple of years, but then up we come again with another cause, another set of disorder which we've got to deal with, and there's always learning. We're never ever going to be the finished article, we're never going to profess to know everything. There's always going to be something out there that's going to surprise us, and we're just ready for it, and ready to learn as much as we can from each of those incidents as we move on.
That's right. And then I think emergency services is very much a learning organisation collectively, and Pat trying out Airbox and using that in terms of developing the way that you work. And perhaps will you be sharing that learning from your pilot? What's the plan with that?
Yeah, so again, similar to Andy, we always have we feed everything back into our organisational learning team, and obviously that could potentially result in sort of joint organisational learning or national organisation learning submissions, depending obviously the nature and and what it is that we've looked at and tried to improve. Again, part of our PESTL approach for using new technologies, as you know, risks and hazards sort of evolve, and the way that we communicate and use information across society evolves as well. But we, as a proof of concept trial, will certainly sort of feed back in, because there are a lot of other fire and rescue services that are looking at how they can utilise things like Airbox. Again, it's not the only capability or technology, but one that we're using because we're led very much by GMP and MWAS, who are using the system as well at the moment. And again, how that's improved and what kind of gap we're looking to sort of close for that overall situational awareness.
Okay, well, hopefully when you've got some news to tell us, we can share it with us and we can put it onto Emergency Services Times, which would be great. Now, I'm afraid that time has absolutely whizzed by. It is now, we've done our 50 minutes. So my just very, very quick last ask to each of you is to give one piece of advice for our listeners, something you'd like to go away and think about as a result of listening to us today. So very, very quickly, Steve, what would your one piece of advice be to our listeners?
I mean, it's clearly with military exercise is exercise and rehearse, and ideally, not on a day, but get it wrong in the exercise, because I certainly have learned more with things that I've got wrong through exercise and rehearsals than I have with things that I've got right. And ideally, if you get it wrong in a rehearsal exercise, hopefully you minimise the chance of it going quite so wrong, acknowledging that a lot of the responses that the teams will be going for are dynamic. And again, you can't predict how it will go.
Excellent. Thank you. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I think the one piece of advice one piece of learning, certainly that's been relevant for us over the last couple of years, is this disinformation, misinformation. If you hear something, or you're given some information, or you read something somewhere, just take a second, just think about it before I share it on, before I pass it on to somebody else, before I confirm that as fact. Let's have a think about it before we share that information and pass it on wider elsewhere, and just consider, is it really factual? Is it really correct? Is it really accurate? Is there any way I can prove or disprove that?
Okay, thank you. And Pat, finally with you.
I think one of the key things that we've taken away from the last 2 years that I've been within this role is the benefits of multi-agency working in those key partnerships. I think if you look at things like the Magisterial Inquiry Recommendation 55, that everybody's using the same sort of systems and information and contact details from and other formats of communication readily available, that enhances and improves our response immeasurably. So those local partnership agreements and those memorandums of understanding are really, really key to us sort of evolving as emergency services together to respond to the new wave of threats.
Okay, thank you all. So we have exercising and rehearsing, learning, questioning information, make sure you don't believe everything you hear, and multi-agency working partnership, which are all absolutely fundamental to the blue light world that we all know. So hopefully you have been able to, our audience has been able to hear our conversation about Airbox and about all of the potential uses of it, and this pilot that Pat is doing, which is very exciting, and to understand what it's like to be a public order officer from Andy there. So thank you so much to all. We could chat for ages, but I'm afraid we have to go. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, and to our viewers. I'm going to do my wrap up now, so I'll say goodbye to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Lovely. So thank you to my speakers for joining me on this very interesting panel this afternoon. Sorry, I've got slightly over. The webinar will be available to watch on catch up via our website. As soon as I finish, you can start watching it all over again. Any notes of the webinar will be hosted there too. So if we add anything in, you can have a look for that. In terms of CPD accreditation, you'll get that by email fairly soon if you've watched it live, and at the end of the month if you're watching on catch up. Our next webinar is on the 13th of November, and we'll be looking at live facial recognition. So do join us for that if you're interested in that area. Also come and see us at emergencyservicestimes.com and read our daily news. We have our digest every day, so you can sign up for that as well. But just leaves me to say thank you very much for watching.